Clause 6.1 is about actions to address risks and opportunities. And it says, when planning for the quality management system, the organization shall consider the interested parties and the internal and external issues and determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. And it's not really specific on exactly how to do this. There's no specific requirement as to the method for doing this in ISO 9001. There's also no specific requirement as to what documented information you need. It needs to be considered at some level in the management review anyway, and it needs to be considered where it's mentioned elsewhere in the standard. This may be added to the management review agenda as part of the management review inputs. You may be doing a process FMAA or risk assessment already, depending on what business you're in, and it needs to be considered wherever there's a change to the QMS. You can look at your process definition worksheet and define where you've identified risks and opportunities in each of the processes. And be prepared to take action if a risk situation is high enough determined by you. 6.1.2, it says the organization shall plan actions to address these risks and opportunities, and how to integrate and implement the action in the quality management system and evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. Actions taken to address the risks and opportunities shall be proportionate to the potential impact of the conformity of product and services. And this goes on to talk about ways you can deal with risk. You can avoid it. You can accept risk in order to pursue an opportunity. You can eliminate the source of the risk, change the likelihood of the consequences, share the risk, or retain the risk by informed decision. That means to say, you don't have to completely do away with the risk, but you have to have your eyes open, so to speak, in terms of how to deal with it. So does this require you to address all risks? Does it require you to address some risks? Well, the answer to both of these is no. It only requires you to address the unnecessary risks as defined by you. And it needs to be no more complicated than risk brainstorming or review of product conformity data, depending on what that looks like for you. It allows you to address the unacceptable risk as defined by you and accept the acceptable risks. It allows you to reduce the risks as part of a business decision, and safety risks can be equal to quality risks as it applies in this case. So here's one of these two-dimensional matrices, and we see these all the time. On one axis you have severity from low to high, and another axis you have probability on low to high. And you in your brainstorming session will determine if something's low severity and low probability, and you're not going to deal with any of those. If something's high severity and high probability, you're going to deal with that and take some kind of action. Someplace in the middle, that's a judgment call that's defined by you. An example of that is tornado shelter. The severity of you being hit by a tornado is pretty high, but the probability is low. So are you going to have a tornado warning system, or are you going to have an action plan where you do rehearsals and that kind of thing? Well, it depends on what part of the country you're in, and that's up to you to make that determination. But you can't eliminate the risk of a tornado unless you dig your factory underground. Similarly, a supplier issue. It has potential high severity, and it's actually moderate possibility, especially in this particular day and age. And one of the action plans you might use is to increase inventory. So here's a list of potential audit questions to be asked generally to anybody in management. They're going to say, where in your system do you address risk? At what point does something become risky enough for you to address it? And can you present an example where you thought about some risky thing and did something about it? So here's some examples of ways that you're probably already using to reduce risk. You maintain an inventory buffer stock. You have multiple suppliers or alternate supply chain sources. You buy insurance. You do hedging. You have contracts, which is a way to reduce risk for both you and your customers. You do supplier evaluations to reduce the risk of an adverse supplier. You do potential outsourcing of critical operations. You do QA inspections. You do disaster planning. All of these things are ways to reduce risk. And it's possible that you're already in conformance with the standard and only need to evaluate their effectiveness in some way. So here's some more about risk reduction. Look for and list ways that you're already addressing risk. You may have a risk assessment process if that suits your needs. It's not required by the standard. So here's a thought question. How risky does something have to be before you do something about it? And that depends on your particular situation and the potential impact of it. What if you have a risk assessment process, find risk, and then not do something about it? Well, that's what's known as audit bait, and the auditor will look for that. So here's some ways to fail at this. First one is to omit or ignore this requirement. Second one is to not document it in any way. The third one is to overcomplicate it. And for an example, you schedule an annual risk assessment meeting and then nobody wants to do it when the annual rolls along. And then finally, forget to evaluate the effectiveness of it. You have to include a statement somewhere in your system about whether your current ways of dealing with risk are effective.